The global data protection regulation is now in effect. What does it mean for podcasters? We're going to talk about it on this episode of Podcastification. My name is Kerry Green, and I am the client happiness guy at podcastfasttrack.com, and this is Podcastification. This show is all about podcasting. How to do it, how not to do it, best practices, interesting news items that have to do with the realm of podcasting, and who knows what else. And I'm trying to do it all with a little bit of fun and some information to help you get a show going, keep yours going, or make it better. And if you like what's going on here on the show, I would appreciate it, so appreciate it, if you could leave a rating or review on iTunes. You can find out how to do that at podcastfasttrack.com/review. That's enough of that kind of stuff. Let's get you podcastificated right away. Back on May 25th, 2018, the GDPR went into effect. What the heck is GDPR? Well, it stands for Global Data Protection Regulation. It's a law that went into effect in the EU, the European Union, and it has to do with how personal data of citizens of the EU or those living, working, traveling through the EU is collected and used. You may be wondering, well, I'm a United States podcaster or a Canada-based podcaster or a South America-based podcaster. What in the heck does an EU regulation have to do with me? Well, here's the answer to the question. It applies to all companies or organizations that market to, sell to, collect data from, or do business with citizens of the European Union or those who live there, work there, travel there. Podcasting is a global thing. I'm telling you, if you have been podcasting for any amount of time, there is no doubt someone from the EU has listened to your show. Now, the question for podcasters really is this. At what point does someone in your audience become a person to which the EU applies when it comes to your podcast? I'm here to tell you that GDPR is pretty convoluted and it's huge and there's lots to read. So it's hard to really narrow down some of the restriction and requirements as to how it applies to podcasting. But I'm going to guess that we as podcasters need to take this seriously in certain cases because the GDPR gives consumers certain rights when it comes to their personal data. And if you do not adhere to what the GDPR says you should do in order to protect the consumer's rights or the person's rights on the other end of your communication, you could be fined up to 20 million euros or 4% of the organization's annual revenue. I mean, that's pretty massive, whichever one is bigger. So it impacts all of us if we're collecting data of any kind. Now, if you host your media in a place like Libsyn or Blueberry or Spreaker or Podbean, likely all of those places have their own GDPR team who has made sure they are adhering to all the requirements of GDPR. But if you have your own website or use some kind of email capture form that enables you to get information from your listeners, say it's an opt-in form, say it's products you're selling, say it's any kind of thing where people give you things like name, email address, mailing address, phone number, anything like that, you should probably take a look at the things within GDPR that apply to your collection of that data because the GDPR impacts how you gather your data, what notifications you need to give to your users about how their data is going to be used and how you're going to both collect it and store it. The GDPR requires certain procedures for how you are to manage your data of users and those kinds of things. There's also this thing in the GDPR where a consumer can request to be forgotten or erased from your database completely. Now, this is not just an unsubscribe button. This is a delete me from your system entirely button, okay? So their data would not be sitting on some server somewhere that you have access to through an account. You have to erase it completely, okay, when it's requested. So you have to have a way to do that. They also have the right to know how their info is used and stored. And if there are brother or sister organizations that you deal with that are maybe under the same corporate umbrella but are not the same company, you can't just pass data from one to the other. So does this apply to podcasters? Well, it depends. Do you gather data from people? My guess is if you have a website of your own, not the one your media host provides, but a website of your own that has some kind of a contact form or some kind of an opt-in form to an email newsletter or some kind of a lead magnet, you probably need to pay attention to GDPR. GDPR is something that can get us in a lot of trouble if we're not careful. So there are a couple of places that I think GDPR applies. The first is those opt-in forms. We really need to take a look at that. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can do that. But also when you have guests on your show, because if you're like me, you collect data from your guests in order to have them on your show, whether that's just an email address or a headshot or those kinds of things. You need to be able to clearly tell your guests what data you're collecting, how you're going to use that data, and how you're going to store that data. I mean, it's all a part of GDPR. Now, let me put in a real quick disclaimer before we get into the weeds of how GDPR steps can be taken. I'm not an attorney. I am not a GDPR expert. I have done a little bit of research and have applied what I think are best practices for my podcast and my business. But you need to do the same thing. Don't only go off the advice that I'm giving here, because it's not really advice. It's just sharing with you some of the knowledge that I've obtained through research and telling you what I'm doing and why I think you need to take some steps to protect yourself. So when we come back from this break, we're going to quickly go through some of the things that you need to be concerned about when it comes to the Global Data Protection Regulation. We'll be right back. Speaking of email opt-ins, I have got this thing that I think every podcaster should sign up for. It is really kind of a lessons learned, ongoing conversation about things that I'm learning from my own clients, from the victories they're having and the mistakes they're making, from the best practices and the worst practices, as well as my own, as I continue my own podcasting journey. It's called the Podcast Optimizer email series. If you're not familiar with an email series, ours is set up this way. You go to the sign up form, you look at what data we need from you according to GDPR regulations, and you sign up. It's a double opt-in, so you're going to get an email from us saying, are you sure you want to subscribe to this list? You hit OK, you hit the link, whatever it gives you, and you're then signed up. What you're going to receive is once a week, you're going to receive a bite-sized chunk of goodness about podcasting best practices. Now, occasionally, and when I say occasionally, maybe once every 2 months, you might receive some kind of a marketing message from us as well, just telling you about one of our services. These are not heavy sell, high pressure things. They're just informative to let you know we have these kinds of things, just kind of like I do here in the mid-roll of my podcast episodes. What you need to do if you want to get in on the Podcast Optimizer email series is go to podcastfasttrack.com/optimizer and sign up, just like I described. You'll get weekly, bite-sized, easy-to-apply chunks of goodness to help you optimize your podcast. Go find the Podcast Optimizer email series from Podcast Fast Track. Okay, when it comes to podcasting and podcasters and this whole GDPR thing, we need to make sure that we are covering ourselves. And like I mentioned before, if your show is hosted on a platform like Libsyn, Blueberry, Spreaker, Podbean, YouTube, SoundCloud, any of those, there may already be some type of a blanket policy in place that is in compliance with GDPR. You need to reach out to your host, I would suggest. In the resources for this episode, which you can find at podcastfasttrack.com/106, or swipe to the description in your podcast player, you will find some links to various resources for some of those platforms that I've been able to track down. I have one for Libsyn, I have one for Blueberry, I have one for Podbean, I have one for Spreaker. Basically, it's pointing you to their Q&A or their privacy policy that relates to GDPR. So if you're using one of those platforms, just go there, see what they're already doing for you. Now, as I mentioned before, if that's the only place you're hosting your podcast and you are not collecting user data through opt-in forms and those kinds of things, that's probably all that you need. But if you have your media on your website, meaning with a player or anything like that, which you should have, by the way, then you're likely going to have to put together your own privacy policy to govern your website. The GDPR requires that you provide information to your audience. And here's the terms that the GDPR uses. It has to be concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible. And that information is supposed to tell them in plain language what it is that you collect, who is really collecting it, so the name of the company or whatever, how it's being collected, why it's being collected, how you're going to use it, who it's going to be shared with, if anybody, what effect that collection is going to have on the individuals. So in other words, are you going to be sending them emails as a result, whatever? And the typical way you should go about doing that is to set up a privacy policy for your website. Now, if you are just a newbie like me to understanding GDPR, the best place to start, I think, is to use some kind of a template for a privacy policy that is already modified or compliant with GDPR. In the show notes for this episode at podcastfasttrack.com/106 and in the description on your app, I'm going to include some links to, I guess they're called automated privacy policy generators that you can check out. I don't know anything about these except that they do this kind of thing and they probably charge you for them. But there's one called Ayubenda. There's another one called Terms Feed. These are places that you can go and get a privacy policy customized to you, your podcast, your business, whatever it is. I'm also going to add a link there to the privacy policy I've put together. Let me give you some disclaimers on that. Do not take my privacy policy and just use it and put in your name, because I did this of my own accord based on my own research. I'm not even sure it's entirely correct, but I don't really want to hire an attorney at this point to look it over for me. So this whole thing is kind of confusing and it's hard, but you need to do something. You need to show that you're doing the very best you can do to inform your users that you're collecting data from of these things that GDPR requires. If you look at any of the opt-in forms on our website, podcastfasttrack.com, you'll notice just underneath, we say very clearly what it is the person's going to receive and provide a link to our privacy policy. That's on every page of our website where there is an opt-in form, because we want it to be clear from the outset. We want you to know what we are going to do with your data. And then that privacy policy, which I'm going to link in the show notes, tells them exactly what we collect, why we collect it, where it's going, all that kind of stuff. So that's really, in a nutshell, the importance of GDPR. There are some other resources I'm going to include, like a GDPR checklist I found online and things like that. This is really not an easy fix unless you want to hire an attorney to do it for you, but then it's financially not feasible for most of us. So I want to encourage you, think this one through. Follow some of those GDPR checklists. There's one that I'm going to provide that is actually very helpful, broken into segments, tells you steps to go through. And there's also a podcast I found called The GDPR Guy. And this guy, Carl, goes through the basic provisions of GDPR one at a time. They're fairly short episodes. And you can kind of get your brain around what GDPR means and how it might affect you as a podcaster. Hello? Oh man, I hate these kinds of things. Legalese, GDPR, more acronyms, laws we have to abide by. But you know, that's the world we live in. And it's to protect our listeners. So I think it's worth the effort to put together some kind of privacy policy. It may be very simple depending on what you're doing, but just to put it together and make it accessible, obviously accessible, to those who may be opting in to the things that we're offering as our marketing tools, as our opt-in offers, those kinds of things. We want people to know that we care about their personal data and that we're going to take care of it once we have it. Well, that's it for this episode of Podcastification. You know what time it is. It's time for you to go out and make it a podcastificating day. This show is brought to you by Podcast Fast Track, where my team provides professional podcasting services without the time suck. Full production, editing, and show notes all in one monthly subscription package. You can find out more at podcastfasttrack.com. Now go out and make it a podcastificating day. Audio editing and show notes by podcastfasttrack.com. Get 15% off your first month by mentioning this show.